fabric of Algeria, its institutions, its education system and its diplomacy. It's worth noting that due to the intensified diplomatic rift between Algeria and France, the country is making a historic shift. Meanwhile, Algeria is officially phasing out French as its primary foreign language. The decision is contained in the two bills presented by Parliament recently, aimed at combating France's colonial legacy, a bold step when pundits share the view that it is time for the continent of Africa to be free from all colonial ties. Is this a bold step towards linguistic sovereignty, or could these create new challenges in terms of diplomacy, communications, trade and education? Today on Talking Points, we dive into the impact of this decision. Will Arabic or English take the center stage away from French? How will these shifts affect Algeria's ties with France and the global economy? And most importantly, what does this mean for millions who have spoken French for generations? Our expert of today, joining us in his capacity as a journalist, will break these down for us. Just stay tuned to For You Media Africa. This is a conversation you wouldn't want to miss. Hello, fervent audience of For You Media Africa. Thank you for joining us once again. To kickstart today's edition of Talking Point, like we mentioned in our preamble, we're focusing on Algeria, North Africa, where the country has finally mentioned that it is, concerned about phasing out French from its various institutions as well as education systems and all. It's worth noting that this was contained in two bills that were presented by Parliament on Sunday amidst diplomatic rifts between the former African, or better, the former colonial nation of Algeria, as well with its former colonial master France. The recent diplomatic rift spans as far as recent years is concerned. To discuss this, we've been joined by SHITTU FOWORA in his capacity as a media personnel. He's joining us all the way from West Africa. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us this day.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on our invitation once again. In a bid to comprehend what's happening in Algeria, in line with the diplomatic tensions that are between Algiers as well as Paris, with these recent developments of the country to phase out French from its system, what are some of the historical roots of the French language in the African country, and why has it remained dormant or more dominant since independence, especially at this time where numerous Pan-Africanists on the African continent are citing that it's time for Africa to be able to, cut loose from all colonial ties that relate or connect the African continent to their colonial masters?
Thank you. Essentially, the roots of French in Africa, dates back to the idea of colonial expansion on the continent. The language was used as a tool for colonialism, in Africa. It was also used as a tool for education and administration. It's seen as, some see it as a post-colonial legacy, and it has strong economic implications, because the language of usage for communication is usually the language of usage for business, and therefore the remnant of French, or the existence or the spread of French on the continent, is seen as one of the tools with which France has influenced the continent to do trade with it. Having said that, there are colonial antecedents, for which Algeria is reacting in this manner. You will remember several parts where France is trying to deny its colonial atrocities, and Algeria continues to insist that those are atrocities that are unforgivable. Those are atrocities that cannot be wished away. Those are atrocities really happened. It must be taught in the history of Algerians and Africans as in extension. But France was trying to dilly-dally with the idea and wasn't too keen on apologizing. And so it has caused diplomatic spat between both countries, a few times. That has caused suspension of flights at some point. It has caused suspension of trade and transaction. It has caused having to severe diplomatic relationship. It has caused Algeria to recall its ambassadors from France a few times. So some of these issues are there. And for the recent time where all of these things are springing up, there are really broad implications for which Africa must continue to exhibit its sense of true independence.
Exactly, and like you mentioned, the French language is a means of communication. It spans across trade and others. Now, I recall in 2005, France recognized a law, a controversial law to be precise, where it was, recognizing some of the so-called positive aspects of colonialism, not just in Algeria, but the African continent. Now, the country in retaliation in 2006 actually came out with a law which was, was not fully finished. And I remember sometime last week, the Speaker of Parliament said it was time for the nation to revisit that law if the country intends to defend its own sovereignty. The first time in which the country is taking legal measures towards, condemning the 132-year French colonial rule that was from 1830 to 1962 in the African nation. With all this, you mentioned that French is not just used in the education sector, neither in the trade, the trade milieu. But with that said, let's look at the economic or the education aspect of all this. How does this new policy shifts impacts Algeria's education system? Given it is going to scrape off this language from every institution, be it the education system, the communication milieu, or better still, the trade milieu, how would this go a long way in affecting the country from, communicating with the rest of the world?
In essence, there are about 5 or 6 areas that I think this particular direction, this particular rule would impact. One of the areas of concern is business and enterprise. Another area of concern is, tourism, the hospitality business in the country. Another area of interest is diplomacy, between both countries. Another area of interest is linguistic sovereignty that you mentioned earlier. Another one is education. So when you look at issue of business, for example, there are business concerns considering how long France has been trading and a lot of French residents in Algeria. You will have to begin to think about the localization of languages. Most of the content, for ads, most of the promos, most of the movie production, most of essentially communication in the country will move from French to Arabic or Tamazight, which is, the Berber language, that the locals speak. You are also looking at opportunities for Arab-speaking people, translators, people documenting history, teachers, lecturers, as the case may be. They may begin to need more Arabic, teachers, more Arabic translators in this sector. Again, you are also looking at the impact on French companies that are resident there. So, because the official communication is in Arabic, such French companies must adopt some fast changing, from some quick reforms for which their documents, their exchanges, would require Arabic. It also means that staff members who might be strictly French speaking may begin to be required to learn Arabic in order to be able to, do trade as it were. So this is, a very serious issue that needs a holistic approach to resolve. Another area that I did mention was diplomatic relationship. Algeria is, multilingual. It is still multilingual, but it means also that it will begin to engage in just one language, probably English and and Arabic. In any case, all of these languages that may be spoken by Algerians are foreign languages to that country. So exiting from French speaking, is not the be-all of this decision, but it is a powerful statement from Algeria trying to show that it is truly independent of France.
Exactly, and that is, where one of the most populated countries, having French-speaking citizens. Now, you mentioned that the numerous sectors that might be touched with this recent decision, but in your capacity as a, one that understands what's happening, what could be some of the challenges that could arise from such a decision? The transition from one language to another.
Okay, so basically there are a few things that we must put into consideration. Algeria does not transact or relate with France alone. It interrelates with many other countries in the world. And so this may be seen, there will be global perception, from the diplomatic standpoint. This is like a symbol of true independence from France. There's also a potential backlash from Francophone world, where some of the aid, support, funding for programs may be cut because of this decision. Again, they're looking at the workforce, people who are working in the country who will now need to understand Arabic, or will now need to communicate in Arabic, or send emails or correspondences in Arabic. So these are areas of potential effects of this decision. Another area of importance will be that the cultural identities of Algeria, a country does not exist in isolation. There are cultural identities that it got from France, which it should ordinarily be proud of. And so if you are stopping the usage of the language, there's a chance that you will also need to erode or do away with certain cultural identities that has been appropriated from France. So a sort of balance needs to be created for this to be effective.
Now, looking at the African continent, we have countries, in as much as we have pundits that do affirm that's important for Africa to cut off from colonial ties, the African continent, they'll have multiple languages, amongst which we are communicating now through English, right? And Algeria happens to be one of those countries on the African continent that do speak French. Looking at Africa in recent times, we've seen African nations, especially those of West Africa and elsewhere, that have been, pushing back away from France. They're trying to cut off all relations they had with France, in as much as there are others that are improving, their closeness as far as diplomatic relations is concerned. Now, how can we align this recent decision, which is still tabled into one of the bills, is not yet been officiated in the African country, to the recent shifts or pushing away of France from the African continent by numerous African countries?
So basically, the anti-French sentiment has been growing for a while. And if France has been doing well by Africa, Africans are not ungrateful people. It will reflect in the way Africans coordinated them. Africa is saying that come to the table, let's discuss as mates, let's discuss on the same footing, at the same level. Don't come to us to dictate to us, to give us orders or to mandate that we must do certain things. Do not expect that we cannot survive without your overlordship. Therefore, the anti-France, anti-French sentiment that we saw on the continent is clear. It's a statement that shows that people are beginning to take their lives seriously. They are beginning to take the life of their country seriously, and they're looking to ensure that they are able to meet the demands of their people. My only worry and fear and concern about the anti-French sentiment is that it may dribble people into a difficult situation. Today, some people are complaining about how long Paul Kagame has stayed in power in Rwanda, not allowing for democratic ethos to prevail, for which a lot of people are afraid to even contest against him. And so, if you have military governments, in power, the most likely thing is for them to not organize elections, for them to stay in the safety of the coup d'etat that they had plotted, and ensure that nobody brings their neck against the line of fire. So, having said that, the reason why all of these things are happening is clear. People feel exploited. A lot of Africans, especially in the Sahel, feel exploited by France, and they are easily happy to see that France and French companies are leaving the continent. However, it will impact us on the overall. But any of the world powers will have to exit our continent or doing business on the continent. So it's a 50-50 situation.
Okay, borrowing from what's happening in Algeria to the African continent, there have been calls for a unified language that could, bring Africans together in a bit of, say, incorporation in the education sector and otherwise. Many cited, Swahili and others. Now, with this latest development of what's happening in Algeria, do you think at this point, just borrowing an example of what's happening in the North African country, Africa is actually ready to embrace a one and common language that could unify its people?
Yeah. So basically, because Africa, is like a continent in a continent. We are it's a whole lot. A country like Nigeria has over 300 ethnic groups. You can imagine what we would rather have as our, a uniform language of communication, let alone the entire Africa. However, we can adopt some approach to it. Choose a language of interest that is most widely spoken in the region and adopt it for usage in, most of, events and policies.
Region to region.
Yes, Tanzania did something similar some years ago, where it gave Swahili that prominence, that importance. And then it became a national thing. Almost everybody will learn Swahili. And so even when you hear them speak in public and speak English, along the line, they puncture the English with, Swahili. Sometimes you see that also in government communication. I'm trying to sometimes get a press release or release in Kiswahili in Tanzania. I would have to reach out to a friend who is in Tanzania or one of the neighboring countries to help me look at this properly and see if these translations are okay. Or outrightly say, listen to this and help me translation. So it's difficult in the initial stage because it is only normal that some of these problems will pop up at this instance. However, it's the hope of government to do what it must do to ensure that more people have access to education and quality education. I keep insisting because that is the only thing that can make people impact the system also positive.
Okay, we have numerous countries, across the African continent that do speak Arabic, like is the case of Algeria, as the country is moving forward to adopting it as its principal language. Now, with that said, how would this benefit relations, trade relations, economic relations between these countries, especially countries that are up north of the African continent? And simultaneously, could this recent move impact foreign investments in the country, especially from French-speaking partners?
Definitely, this will impact foreign investments on the continent, and especially in Algeria. Don't forget that a lot of French-speaking people go to Algeria on an annual basis for tourism. They have special programs that they attend in Algeria and other parts of North Africa. And so Algeria may be delisted as one of the destinations for some French speakers. Again, it could mean that French speakers who are seeking to do business on on the continent, or sorry, in Algeria as the case may be, will need to factor in extra cost of doing business, because they have to transition between the French,
translation,
the Arabic, translations and all that. Even in business negotiations, those who know that there is no more French in as official language of use, it means that they would rather use probably Arabic as the case may be. So there's a lot that we are looking at with this.
All right, now you mentioned earlier on in one of your previous responses that this is equally going to affect, tourism, the tourism sector. Scraping off French entirely from the country's maybe curricular education system or trade network, do you believe that's equally going to impact the amount of revenue that is going to come into the country in terms of the tourism sector? Say, the countries up north of Africa, especially a nation like Algeria, do tend to attract a lot of tourists, especially at some particular point of the year. With that said, do you believe that this is going to, reduce the revenue that is going to come in from that sector, given that maybe at some point before the decision was taken, the tourists that used to come in maybe were coming from France or from else or other French-speaking countries from across the globe?
Well, there are more Arabic speakers in the world than French speakers. So
that is true.
While France and other French-speaking parts of the world may not be excited about going to Algeria, there's a chance that its immediate neighbor in the Middle East and North Africa will be willing to do more, invest more in that sector. But I anticipate a drop in revenue for Algeria, but I'm also thinking that the government, the authorities in Algeria will have made up for modalities that will cushion the shock or the shortfall from the investment in that sector. So yes, it should be anticipated, but again, we should not lose sight of the fact that the neighbors of Algeria are mostly Arabic speaking, and therefore they should or could be able to see or where French speakers are unable to speak. Again, there are arts and cultural events that are in French that will require Algeria's participation. With this decision, I'm not sure this is something that France will be eager about. So there are many sides to it, to affect culture, to affect tourism, to affect investment, to affect business.
Now, Algeria is the only country, and you mentioned that this move is in line with true independence and a big win for the African continent. Given what's happening in Algeria, when you look at what's happening at this particular point in time, let's recall what happened in West Africa with the countries of the Alliance of Sahel states when they took off the move to, send French with a growing anti-French sentiment, send France away from their territories. With this move, are we seeing some sort of rapprochement between Algeria and the Alliance of Sahel states in terms of the decision which they have taken in recent years? We equally saw that in Central Africa with Chad recently.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chance that there'll be more alliances between Algeria and the Sahel states that are looking towards the east. There's more trade and investment, there's more collaboration, there's more industrialization, considering that some of the Sahel states are aligning with France and aligning with Russia and aligning with China. So it's not out of place that we are seeing all of this. The same way Algeria is cutting diplomatic ties from France, we also see that the new president of the United States is having some trade reforms, and these trade reforms are going to be offsetting a lot in terms of business. And the fact that there's a chance that they will sever ties with or severe funding, stop funding for some activities in Africa, for some activities in South Africa, it means that Africa must begin to define how it approaches the world. Why should we be the epicenter of aid donations every year? When will Africa become truly independent and unwilling to accept donations, aid donations, and in fact refer such aid donations to other parts of the world? Because we must have become sufficient, in our own rights. That's my take on that.
All right. Now let's look at another aspect. You mentioned that it's time for Africa to redefine its stance, in terms of its foreign policies with the rest of the globe. Now, how does this go a long way if Africa has to get to that standpoint where it has to redefine? We saw the United States is creating funds equally for South Africa and others, like you mentioned, the African continent as a whole. With these, what holistic approach can Africa take in the wake of some of this, these firm blows that are coming at Africa, to be able to redefine the way it looks at its cooperation with the rest of the world and position itself as a continent that is self-sufficient?
You see, for Africa to be truly independent, it must look out for ways to explore its resources. Most times, the resources that we focus on the continent are the mineral resources. But what we realize is that the most amount of wealth generation in the world at the moment comes from people who have mental resources, people who are prepared to challenge and disrupt the global direction and say that, let's do these things differently and we're going to achieve something even much more better. So you have tech innovation, young investment in these ventures who will be able to do what? Who will be able to truly invest in the system and ensure that the system works. So Africa must look at researching what it needs, investing in education and health, also development, infrastructural development that will boost trade across the continent, because we have a continent where a lot of people trade with others from outside the continent than trade within the continent. So all of these issues must be addressed. We have to dismantle the barriers of trade and investment to ensure that we are able to grow better.
Yeah, you mentioned the issue of dismantling, trade and investment, and of course, Algeria stands to be one of those countries on the African continent, one of the few that, as of 2024, were regarded as partner countries of the BRICS group of emerging economies. Now, being part of this bloc, could this decision, or being a partner country of the bloc that stands to be one of the countries that is at this point defeating the group of G7, could we say that its somewhat participation within the BRICS group could have influenced this decision, given that the country will have some sort of economic backing to be able to sustain itself if it cuts loose from francs?
Definitely. One of the impetus, one of the major driving factors for Africa's reassertion of its sovereignty is the fact that it is having better alternatives from Asia. This is, when you have two options, you're able to weigh and say, what are, the things that we can leverage from all of this. Africa is a resource pool, destination for a lot of resources, both, mental resources and mineral resources. And so you see the foreign partners or foreign countries coming to the continent to offer something for something. They give and then they take. They give whatever it is they are giving, and then they take whatever it is they need to take. However, if we must strengthen ourselves, we must truly be economically independent and industrialize ourselves in ways that more people can get jobs, in ways that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement can be, actioned upon. We must also be able to promote self-sufficiency. There are a lot of products, agricultural products that we can produce here, and we are still important. We need to stop that. We need to ensure that we have energy generation and technology transfer. Technology that we do not have, we can pay for it. But technology that we cannot pay for, we can ask that it be replicated on the continent, and some people will learn. There are also other impacts, you know, on us as a people, that we are moving towards BRICS. Someone will say, are you moving from one colonial entity to another colonial entity? It's not exactly that way. What we see is that the continued involvement of African states with BRICS has continued to yield positive stuff, because there's a lot of development, infrastructure development, that I can attest to, and many people can attest to on the continent. So again, it will shift our politics and governance approach, governance reforms, because some of the complaints, you know, for which some of these issues are popping up around issues of diplomacy, trade, and investment.
Now, on the line of diplomacy, you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AfCFTA. Now, with being a partner country like a nation like Nigeria with Algeria, and the country stands to, you know, partner with other countries across the African continent. Let's look at it from a global perspective. With the AfCFTA, given it's not been able to be fully implemented on the African continent, is because, you know, all African countries have not yet ratified this agreement, you know, in ensuring that it is fully implemented within the continent of Africa. With such decisions, could we say that Algeria might, are you anticipating that Algeria might, you know, intensify its relations with other African countries, be it in terms of trade, in terms of cooperation, and so on and so forth, at this particular point, and that is actually, you know, cutting off ties with France?
Yeah, absolutely. While it does this, it's a given that Algeria will reach out more to its neighbors, which are generally African neighbors and its Caribbean neighbors, and it will basically fill up the gaps that will be left by the stoppage of French speaking in the country, French usage for official communication. So it's almost a given. Another area that it must be looking at is strengthening its defense autonomy, because a country that is unable to defend itself is actually on a very delicate precipice. So Algeria has to look towards improving its military capacity, and that is also possible by aligning with some African nations that, you know, are top there when it comes to military relations.
Now, looking at what this could inspire in West Africa and other parts of the African continent, given this move, let's borrow examples from what happened in West Africa. We saw when it started in one country within, you know, the ECOWAS bloc, it moved to other countries. Though it's not the wish, but then could these shifts in you know, the language policy in Algeria, could it inspire a similar move in other French-speaking African countries?
Well, there's a possibility. There's a possibility that other countries may begin to look in the direction of Algeria to revoke French elements of French presence from their countries, and adopt policies that will brighten, you know, opportunities for them and, you know, their countrymen, and build up trust between the region. I think it's a very possibility.
So at this point, given that you mentioned in one of your responses that this might impact economic cooperation as well as education and diplomacy, let's borrow an example, and I'll try to see how we could expand this to a global perspective and look at the African continent. With such decisions, would you, or do you share the opinion that Africa is indeed ready to welcome, you know, the initiative of a single currency as well as a single language on the African continent?
Yeah, for us on the continent, we can only get better through it being intentional. You're talking about improved diplomacy, you're talking about intelligence corporations, you're talking about improved tourism, and, rights, or what do you call it, restrictions of travel. We need to open up our visa policies. A few African countries now allow other Africans to arrive, and get visa on arrival. That makes for business to be better because you don't need to go through the hassles of, doing stuff from the immigration. So it's totally up to us on the continent to do what we can do to ensure that, yes, those who we are supervising have value for these policies that are being adopted in recent times.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point on 4U Media Africa, and of course we are discussing this latest developments in the North African country of Algeria, where the country is poised to, scrape up, or better still, phase out French as an official language in the African country, and this comes against the backdrop of the recent diplomatic rift that exists between Algeria and Paris. And of course, with our guests this day, we're trying to comprehend the impact that this might come, or that might come with this recent decision about the African country. Now, Shittu, we were discussing earlier, and you mentioned that there is a possibility that it is time for Africa to be able to redefine its stance in terms of cooperation with the rest of the world, especially the African country of Algeria at this particular point in time. Now, in a bit to further deepen our understanding of this topic, Africa in itself has fewer countries that speak French, but we have countries, like I mentioned earlier, we have countries that are, of the English-speaking origin. With these countries on the African continent, amongst which we have a nation like Nigeria that stands as one of the most populous countries on the African continent, the most populous nation on the African continent, could we see a possibility of the country embracing other languages aside Arabic, in trying to see how it could deal with its own cooperation with the rest of the African continent, and to some extent a cooperation or intensify cooperation with the rest of the world?
Yes, one of the things that we must note quickly is that outside France, there is nowhere else in the world where we have as much as 50 million French speakers. French speakers in DR Congo, for example, about 50 million. You'll see that up to this moment, DR Congo has remained unstable. I'm not saying that it is the French that is causing this instability, but it is a given that even while we are looking at how the severance of ties of the policy on the use of French in official communication, we must realize that all of this is to begin to shape and reshape how we do business on the continent, how we do business amongst ourselves, and how we are able to export content. Because for African content producers whose target, for example, are French speakers, there may be difficulties in trying to put things together meant for global consumption, because again, you would need a lot of collaboration. The world today works better based on collaboration, but when there is a disregard for ethos and certain principles of governance or mutual trust is broken, then it begins to give room for decisions like this. So it may become a contagion, but I do not see that strong sentiment, in the region beyond Algeria.
All right, but then do you believe that with these firm measures that Algeria is taking, former colonial masters might begin to reconsider as far as, picking up responsibility and acknowledging some of the colonial atrocities that were being perpetrated on the African continent during the colonial era?
Come again, please.
Yeah, so I was asking that with this recent decision, are you of the opinion that some previous colonial masters or colonial powers that had colonized the African continent might begin reconsidering the aspect of asking for, trying to get acknowledgements, or better still, remorse for what was perpetrated, some of the colonial atrocities that were being perpetrated during the colonial era on the African continent?
The colonialist complex is such that they do not apologize. Most times when they apologize, it is half-hearted apologies. If they have their ways, some of them will repeat their colonial crime. We know that because of the way they relate with African countries. And so Africans must continue to look at issues from a very, very methodical perspective, as against waiting to hope and see that, colonialists apologize. We should do things for which they will on their own be willing to, come to us more than we go to them. In that way, it shows that even beyond colonialism, we have outgrown the oppression, we have outgrown the dark face of our lives as nations. Therefore, that would ensure that we go to any table and with our shoulders high, and not always going to the tables requesting for support, requesting for aid, requesting for funding, as the case may be. So yes, other countries on the continent may begin to consider being more supportive, being more considerate, being more flexible, but we should not bank on that, regardless of if they offer apologies or if they become more understanding of the colonial past. It doesn't really change matters.
All right. So do you equally share the opinion? Because, Ghana in Africa stands to be one of those countries, especially the former Ghanaian president, or one of those nations, presidents, that had been very vocal on reiterating that it was time for Africa to get some sort of colonial reparations for some of the atrocities that were perpetrated during the colonial era. With the 132-year colonial rule that happened in line with what's happening in Algeria, what the country witnessed from 1830 to 1962, cutting off francs, do you believe the country would get that reparation which it actually intends to get? Because if the country is taking some sort of legal measures, it's because francs in recent times have violated the sovereignty in one way or the other of the African countries. So do you think that this bold step could bring the country some sort of, win in one way or the other?
In essence, it is a beautiful thing that we are considering issues of reparation and all that. But primarily, I do not see how these reparations will change anything about us on the continent. I say this because when you pay reparation, it's like a penalty in court. Those that you relate to begin to see things from a better perspective, a clearer perspective, that they owe us something. I do not believe that the colonialists owe us anything. And that is why I do not believe either in the foreign aid that we donate. Left to me, share with us technological expertise, share with us groundbreaking research, share with us cutting-edge solutions. Let us be able to transfer technology ideas and solutions to our own people. We have no reason importing cars on the continent. I'd rather we produce and manufacture these cars here, right here, on the continent. But what do we have? A lot goes into importing, vehicles every year. Governments, officials, politicians, private persons in the continent, on the continent, buying some of these products because there's nowhere it could be or it is being manufactured in the country. There's nobody talking about it, and it is sad. So, while we think that reparation may look good on paper, the truth of the matter is we've been receiving donations, funding for projects that will impact humanity, You know, why do we think the need to still demand that, you know, reparations be paid, you know, by this, you know, the foreign colonialists?
All right, now we are gradually coming to the end of today's conversation. Shittu, now, in your perspective, as an African, first of all, before being an expert, do you believe, or what is truly needed for Africa to gain true independence?
So for Africa to gain true independence, it must strengthen collaboration amongst itself. I mean, I have always said that what is the point doing a lot of trade with other parts of the world and not doing trade with yourselves? Why is it more expensive to import, you know, from Djibouti to Kenya, for example, as against to import from China to Kenya? We must be able to strengthen ourselves through trade and investment, through education, adoption of best practices, best democratic practices, and knowledge transfer. When we invest in knowledge sharing, when we invest in education funding, we will have better quality, you know, electorate, quality masses for which they decide the quality of leaders that will lead them. You know, the defunding of education is partly responsible for why we do not have good governance, we do not have quality leaders, and we do not have elections reflecting the true will of the masses on the continent.
Okay, now to conclude, in the way forward from today's conversation, chatting the way forward for Algeria and the African continent, what could you pass across to our African audience as, you know, what lessons could be drawn from this recent move, and of course, what should be the way forward for the African country towards defending its interests as, first of all, an African country before being a former colonial territory on the African continent?
So basically, it is how we blow our trumpets. I mean, nobody can blow our trumpets better than we do. So if we must praise ourselves, we must praise ourselves right for doing what is right. If we take lessons from Algeria, we can begin to examine the ties we have with, you know, foreign countries, with colonial peers who have been on the continent for several years, shaping the original, you know, direction of the continent. I'm not sure that we will be where we are today if we didn't have the type of colonialism that happened on the continent. Now, therefore, African states must continue to strengthen infrastructure, must continue to strengthen, you know, mental capacities of, you know, their citizens, must continue to invest and fund education properly, so that we can have solutions that the world is waiting for, solutions that the world is willing to pay for. That way, we'll become truly independent through our collaboration, through the quality of education, through the quality of output, through the quality of exports, you know, that we are putting out from the continent.
Thanks, Shittu, for your immense and insightful contribution in today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you for having me.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, we do appreciate and thank you for your keen attention. We appreciate you participating or watching and listening to For You Media Africa in this edition of Talking Point. It's on this note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of this edition of the program over your Pan-African channel. Thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and to stay in company of our numerous programs.